A homeless Navy SEAL spent his last $4,000 on a dying garage. Then his dog uncovered a secret worth $100 million. A homeless Navy SEAL bought an abandoned garage. His dog found a $100 million car collection. In a frozen Colorado mountain town, former Navy SEAL Mason Reed had nothing left but an aging pickup truck and his loyal German Shepherd, Shadow. But when the dog refused to stop digging beneath a forgotten garage, they uncovered a hidden underground kingdom and a decades-old secret powerful men would do anything to possess. What started as survival would become the fight of a lifetime. Comment 1 if you'd follow your instincts no matter the risk, or 0 if you'd walk away. And tell us where you're watching from. Snow drifted across the empty streets of Silver Creek, Colorado, like pale ghosts wandering through a town that had learned how to survive long winters. The mountains surrounding the valley stood dark and silent beneath a gray morning sky, their peaks hidden behind low clouds. Smoke curled from a handful of chimneys. A snowplow groaned somewhere in the distance. Most people were still inside their warm homes, drinking coffee and waiting for the day to begin. But Mason Reed had been awake for hours. His eyes snapped open before dawn. The nightmare had returned. Again. For a few seconds he couldn't breathe. The darkness around him felt too familiar, too close, too much like another place, another time. His pulse hammered in his ears. His hands instinctively searched for a rifle that wasn't there. Then he felt something warm press against his arm. A wet nose. A familiar weight. Shadow. The German Shepherd sat beside him in the darkness of the truck cab, watching him with calm brown eyes. Mason slowly exhaled. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered. The dog remained still, steady, present, the way he always was. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windshield of the old Ford pickup. The truck wasn't much to look at. Rust crept along the wheel wells. The heater worked only when it felt like it. The driver's seat had a tear patched together with duct tape. But for the past 11 months, it had been home. Mason rubbed his face and checked the dashboard clock. 4:17 a.m. Another night with almost no sleep. Another morning waking up exhausted. He opened the truck door. Cold mountain air rushed inside. Shadow jumped out first and landed in the snow. Mason followed. The abandoned lumber yard where he parked stretched behind him, quiet and forgotten. Old buildings stood crooked beneath layers of snow. Stacks of weathered timber sat buried under white drifts. Nobody came here anymore. That was why he liked it. Nobody asked questions. Nobody stared. Nobody recognized him. Mason walked toward the edge of the property while Shadow trotted beside him. The town lights glowed faintly below. Silver Creek wasn't a big place. A few thousand people. One diner, one grocery store, one gas station. A place where everyone knew everyone, or at least they used to. These days, Mason wasn't sure anybody knew him at all. Maybe that was easier. He stood quietly as dawn slowly painted the mountains blue. Years ago, mornings looked different. Years ago, he had purpose. Mission briefings, schedules, brothers beside him, a reason to get up. Now there was only survival. The wind swept across the valley. Mason shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. Shadow leaned gently against his leg. The dog seemed to know exactly when the memories became too heavy. He always did. The two of them had been together for nearly 7 years. 3 combat deployments, hundreds of patrols, more close calls than Mason could count. When Mason left the military, Shadow retired too. Most people saw a dog. Mason saw family, the only family he had left. His parents had passed away years earlier. His marriage hadn't survived the long deployments and the nightmares that followed. The friends he still had were scattered across the country, fighting battles of their own. But Shadow remained. Always. No matter how bad things became. The sun finally climbed above the mountains. The town began to wake. Mason climbed back into the truck. They headed toward Main Street. The diner sat near the center of town beneath a faded sign that read, Millie's Cafe. Inside, warmth wrapped around him immediately. Coffee smelled stronger than anything else. A few ranchers sat at the counter discussing weather. An older couple shared breakfast near the window. Nobody paid much attention to him. Mason preferred it that way. "Morning, Mason?" called Millie from behind the register. He nodded. "Morning." "The usual, please." A few minutes later, she brought him coffee and eggs. She always added extra toast. She never charged him for it. Neither of them mentioned it. Pride was a delicate thing, especially for men like Mason. Shadow settled beside the booth. Several regular customers greeted the dog. Nobody greeted Mason. Not because they disliked him. They simply didn't know what to say. Veterans made people uncomfortable sometimes, especially broken ones. Mason ate slowly. His gaze drifted toward the television mounted above the counter. A local news station played quietly. County announcements scrolled along the bottom of the screen. One line caught his attention. County surplus auction Saturday. Properties available. Mason looked away, then looked back. Something about it lingered in his mind. Later that morning, he walked toward the county administration building. Snow crunched beneath his boots. Shadow moved beside him. The bulletin board near the entrance displayed auction notices. Most were old storage lots, unused land, vacant structures. Then Mason saw it. One photograph. A neglected garage. The building stood alone against a backdrop of pine-covered hills. The caption read, "Property number 17, Black Pine Road. Former automotive repair facility. Isasukaha. Ezez Condition County minimum bid, $4,000. Mason stared at the image. Something about it felt familiar. Not the building itself. The feeling. A place abandoned by everyone else. A place people had written off. He understood that feeling. The garage looked weather-beaten, forgotten. Still standing anyway. A county employee approached. "You interested in that one?" Mason glanced up. "Maybe." The man shrugged. "Nobody else is." "Why?" "Too remote. Needs work. Probably more trouble than it's worth." Mason nodded. The employee chuckled. "Honestly, it'll probably sit empty another 10 years. Mason looked at the photograph again. Black Pine Road. A garage nobody wanted. For some reason, he folded the auction flyer and slipped it into his pocket. The rest of the day passed slowly. He picked up temporary work unloading supplies behind a hardware store. The pay wasn't much, but every dollar mattered. As evening settled over Silver Creek, he returned to the lumber yard. The temperature dropped quickly. The mountains disappeared into darkness. Mason sat in the truck cab holding the folded flyer. Shadow rested nearby. The yellow light from a small flashlight illuminated the paper. Property number 17, Black Pine Road. The words seemed simple, meaningless. Yet he couldn't stop staring at them. His savings weren't much, just enough to survive another few months if he was careful. Buying a garage would be reckless, dangerous, possibly stupid. The logical choice was obvious. Walk away. Keep surviving. Keep drifting. Keep waiting for life to happen. But another voice whispered something different. A quieter voice. One he hadn't heard in years. What if surviving isn't enough anymore? Mason looked through the windshield. Snow continued falling. The world outside was silent. For a moment he imagined the garage, the empty building, the possibility. A roof, a workshop, a purpose. Maybe nothing would come from it. Maybe it truly was worthless. But for the first time in a very long time, something ahead of him looked like more than another day. Shadow lifted his head. The dog stared at Mason, then gently placed one paw on his knee. Mason smiled faintly. The first real smile in weeks. "You think I'm crazy, buddy?" Shadow tilted his head. Mason laughed quietly. The sound surprised even him. He looked down at the flyer one more time, then folded it carefully. Outside, snow continued falling across Silver Creek. The mountains stood silent. The town slept. And somewhere beyond those dark hills sat a forgotten garage waiting for Saturday's auction. Neither Mason nor Shadow could possibly know it yet, but that abandoned building was about to change everything. Everything. Saturday morning arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. Snow covered the mountains surrounding Silver Creek, turning the valley into a world of white and gray. The courthouse parking lot was crowded with pickup trucks, ranch vehicles, and contractors looking for bargains at the county auction. Mason Reed stood near the back of the crowd, with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Shadow sat quietly beside him. The German shepherd's thick coat was dusted with snowflakes. Most people ignored them. A few recognized Mason. None approached. That was fine with him. The auctioneer moved through the list quickly. Storage sheds, vacant lots, old trailers, properties changed hands in minutes. Mason barely listened. His attention remained fixed on a single sheet of paper folded in his pocket. Property number 17, Black Pine Road. The abandoned garage. As the morning wore on, fewer bidders remained. The cold drove some people home. Others had already purchased what they came for. Finally, the auctioneer cleared his throat. Next item, Property 17. Former automotive repair garage located on Black Pine Road. Structure sold as is. No warranties. A photograph appeared on a display board. The same building Mason had studied all week. Weathered siding, rusting roof, faded sign. Forgotten. The auctioneer looked around. Opening bid, $4,000. Silence. A gust of wind swept through the parking lot. Nobody raised a hand. The auctioneer tried again. 4,000? Nothing. Several contractors exchanged amused glances. One man laughed quietly. That place should be bulldozed. A few others nodded. The auctioneer sighed. Any bid at all? Mason felt his pulse quicken. His savings account held almost everything he had left. Years ago, risking money had been easy. Now every dollar carried weight. Every dollar represented meals, gasoline, survival. He looked down at Shadow. The dog sat calmly beside him, watching, waiting. For some reason, Mason suddenly remembered something his old team leader used to say. Sometimes the biggest risk is standing still. Before he could second-guess himself, Mason raised his hand. I'll bid. The crowd turned. The auctioneer pointed. I have a bid. Again, silence. No competing offers came. Nobody wanted the garage. 30 seconds later, the auctioneer struck the gavel. Sold. Just like that. The building belonged to Mason Reed, a homeless veteran living in a truck. The thought felt ridiculous, and yet strangely hopeful. For the first time in years, he owned something, even if everyone else considered it worthless. By early afternoon, Mason and Shadow were driving north along Black Pine Road. The road wound through dense pine forests and rocky hillsides. Snow-covered branches hung over the pavement. The farther they traveled, the more isolated the landscape became. Eventually, the garage appeared through the trees. Mason slowed the truck. The building sat alone in a clearing near the base of a mountain ridge. A chain-link fence surrounded part of the property. Most of it had collapsed years ago. Tall weeds poked through snowdrifts. The faded sign above the entrance barely remained readable. Black Pine Auto Repair. The final letters had nearly disappeared. Mason parked. For several moments, he simply stared. The garage looked even worse in person. One of the front windows was broken. Paint peeled from the walls. The large bay doors sagged slightly on their tracks. Yet something about the place felt solid, stubborn, like it refused to fall apart, despite years of neglect. A little like him. Shadow jumped from the truck first. The dog immediately began exploring. Mason grabbed the keys and approached the entrance. The lock resisted at first, then finally clicked open. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it inward. Cold air drifted from the darkness inside. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. The interior looked frozen in time. Old tool cabinets lined the walls. Workbenches stood exactly where mechanics had left them decades earlier. Shelves contained rusted parts, empty oil containers, and faded manuals. A calendar hung near an office door. The year printed across the top read 1998. Mason slowly walked deeper inside. His boots echoed against the concrete floor. The silence felt almost sacred, not abandoned. Waiting. He couldn't explain why. He just felt it. Shadow trotted past him. The dog's nails clicked softly across the floor. Then he stopped. His ears lifted. Mason noticed immediately. Years of military work had taught him to recognize the smallest changes in the dog's behavior. Shadow wasn't nervous. He wasn't excited. He was focused. Very focused. The German Shepherd stared toward the far corner of the garage, near an old welding station, near a section of wall covered with shelves and forgotten equipment. "What is it?" Mason asked. Shadow took several steps forward, sniffed the air, then continued staring. Mason walked over. Nothing seemed unusual. Just dust, tools, scrap metal. He shrugged. Probably a mouse. Shadow didn't move. For nearly a minute, the dog remained fixed on the area. Eventually, Mason returned to exploring. The rest of the afternoon disappeared into work. He opened windows, swept floors, cleared debris, organized old equipment. Years of Navy SEAL discipline returned naturally, one task at a time, one objective at a time. By sunset, the garage looked slightly less forgotten. Not much, but enough. The sky outside turned orange behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the snow-covered property. Mason stood in the center of the garage, breathing heavily. His muscles ached. His hands were dirty. For the first time in months, exhaustion felt earned, not empty, earned. A faint smile touched his face. This place needed work, a lot of work, but it could become something. Maybe a repair shop, maybe a restoration garage, maybe simply a roof over his head. For now, that was enough. He turned toward Shadow. The dog wasn't beside him. Mason looked around, then spotted him, still standing near the welding station, still staring at the same corner. Hours later. Mason frowned. Seriously? Shadow glanced back, then returned his attention to the corner. The behavior was unusual, very unusual. Military working dogs didn't obsess over nothing. Mason walked over again. This time he studied the area more carefully. The shelves appeared old. The wall looked normal. The concrete floor showed decades of stains and wear. Nothing jumped out at him. Nothing except Shadow's persistence. The dog finally approached the corner, lowered his nose, sniffed slowly, then sat down, as if he had made a decision. Mason crossed his arms, The old instincts that had kept him alive overseas whispered quietly in the back of his mind. Pay attention. Details matter. Things are not always what they seem. He looked around once more, then shook his head. Tomorrow. He'd look again tomorrow. Outside, darkness settled over Black Pine Road. The mountains disappeared into the night. Mason rolled out a sleeping bag inside the office rather than return to the lumber yard. The room was cold, but it had walls, a roof, a door that locked. It already felt better than the truck. Shadow settled nearby. The German Shepherd remained alert longer than usual. His gaze occasionally drifted toward the far corner of the garage, toward the welding station, toward something only he seemed interested in. Mason noticed, and despite himself, curiosity began to grow. Because one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Shadow wasn't ready to let that corner go. And if there was one lesson Mason had learned during 7 years beside that dog, it was that Shadow was rarely wrong. The wind rattled the garage windows sometime after midnight. Mason woke instantly. Not from a nightmare. Not this time. From silence. A strange kind of silence. The kind that made his military instincts sit upright before his eyes even opened. The old office was dark except for a thin strip of moonlight slipping through the blinds. Snow reflected pale light outside. For a moment, he lay still, listening. Shadow wasn't beside the sleeping bag. That immediately got his attention. Mason sat up. His joints ached from the previous day's work. The office felt colder now. He slipped on his boots and stepped into the garage. The vast building sat beneath layers of darkness and shadows. Moonlight filtered through dirty windows. The place felt larger at night. Older. Almost alive. Then he spotted Shadow. The German Shepherd stood exactly where he'd been standing earlier. Near the welding station. Near the corner. His ears were forward. His posture rigid. Watching. Waiting. Mason walked toward him. "What is it, buddy?" Shadow looked briefly at him, then lowered his nose toward the floor. Mason crouched. The concrete appeared unchanged. Oil stains, dust, decades of wear. Nothing unusual. Yet the dog remained fixed on the spot. After another minute, Mason finally sighed. Tomorrow. Shadow didn't seem convinced. Neither was Mason. But exhaustion eventually won. The next morning dawned bright and cold. Sunlight poured through the garage windows. The mountains surrounding Black Pine Road looked sharp and clear beneath fresh snow. Mason brewed coffee using an old camp stove. Shadow sat nearby, watching him, watching the corner, watching both. The behavior had gone beyond curiosity. Something was bothering the dog. Something specific. After breakfast, Mason decided to investigate properly. Years in special operations had trained him to trust observation over assumptions. If Shadow kept returning to the same location, there had to be a reason. He moved shelves away from the wall, dragged old equipment aside, swept years of dust from the floor. Nothing. The concrete beneath appeared ordinary. Still, Shadow remained focused. Mason studied the area more carefully. Then something caught his eye, a faint difference in coloration, barely noticeable, a slightly darker section of concrete near the corner. Most people would never have seen it. But Mason had spent years searching for hidden doors, concealed compartments, and improvised threats. Tiny irregularities mattered. He knelt down, ran his fingers across the surface. The texture changed slightly. Interesting. Very interesting. He grabbed a hammer from a nearby toolbox, then tapped lightly across the floor. Tap, 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 solid, tap, 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 solid, then thunk. Mason stopped. His eyes narrowed. He struck again, thunk. Different. Definitely different. The sound wasn't solid concrete. It was hollow. Shadow immediately stood, his tail lifted. Mason felt a chill run through him, the kind of chill that had nothing to do with weather. Now he knew. The dog wasn't imagining anything. Something existed beneath the floor. The question was what? For the next several hours, Mason worked methodically. He cleared every object from the area, measured distances, examined seams, checked the walls. Eventually, he discovered something almost invisible. A narrow metal edge buried beneath decades of grime. His pulse quickened. The shape formed a rectangle. Large. Very large. A concealed hatch. "What the hell is this place?" he whispered. Shadow sat beside him, watching, almost as if he had been waiting for Mason to catch up. The hatch appeared locked from below. Years of dust and corrosion had sealed it tightly. Mason spent the afternoon searching the garage for clues. Inside old tool cabinets, storage lockers, office drawers. Most contained nothing useful. Then he found an aging blueprint tube hidden behind a filing cabinet. Inside were faded construction drawings. Many pages were unreadable. Others had water damage. But one detail stood out. The original garage plans didn't match the existing building. A section was missing. An entire area beneath the structure wasn't shown, almost as if someone had deliberately removed it. Mason stared at the documents. Questions multiplied. Who built this place? Why hide part of the structure? What was underneath? As afternoon sunlight faded, snow began falling again. The garage grew darker. Shadow remained beside the hatch, never wandering far, never losing interest. Mason returned to the office and spread the blueprints across a desk. His eyes moved over faded lines and handwritten notes. Then one notation caught his attention. Storage access. The remaining text had been smudged away. Storage access to what? The mystery deepened. That night he barely slept. The questions wouldn't leave him alone. Neither would the feeling. The feeling that he stood on the edge of something important. Something hidden. Something forgotten. At dawn he made a decision. The hatch was coming open, no matter what it took. By mid-morning, he had gathered every tool that might help. Crowbars, pry bars, penetrating oil, a portable jack. The work was exhausting. Hours passed. The frozen metal refused to move, but Mason was stubborn. More stubborn than rust. More stubborn than time. Finally, sometime after noon, a loud crack echoed through the garage. The hatch shifted, only an inch, but it moved. Shadow immediately jumped to his feet. Mason's heart began racing. He inserted the crowbar deeper, pulled harder. The metal groaned. Dust exploded upward. Another inch, then another. Finally, the entire hatch lifted. Cold air rushed upward from below, air that smelled ancient, dry, undisturbed, like a room sealed for decades. Mason stepped back. Neither he nor Shadow moved for several moments. The opening revealed darkness. Nothing else. Just darkness. Deep darkness. Mason grabbed a flashlight. Its beam cut through the shadows. A ladder descended into the earth. Not a small storage space. Not a utility room. A real descent. Far deeper than any ordinary garage basement. The flashlight beam vanished into blackness. Mason slowly exhaled. The mountain seemed silent outside. Even the wind had stopped, as if the entire world were waiting. Shadow approached the opening first. The dog peered downward, then looked back at Mason. Ready. Mason couldn't help smiling. You found it, didn't you? Shadow's tail moved once. The former seal shined the light downward again. Questions flooded his mind. Who built this? Why hide it? What had remained untouched beneath his feet all these years? He had purchased a forgotten garage. Now he stood above a secret buried beneath a Colorado mountainside. And every instinct he possessed told him that once he climbed down that ladder, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The darkness below waited, silent, patient, keeping secrets that had survived for decades. And somewhere inside those shadows lay the answer to why Shadow refused to stop searching. Mason stood motionless at the edge of the open hatch. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below. The flashlight beam disappeared into blackness so complete it looked almost solid. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved. The garage around them seemed distant now. Small. Unimportant. Everything that mattered existed beneath their feet. Shadow stepped closer to the opening. His ears stood forward. Alert. Focused. Ready. Mason adjusted the flashlight in his grip. Years of military training whispered caution. Unknown space. Unknown structure. Unknown risks. But another feeling pushed against the caution. Curiosity. Powerful curiosity. The kind that changes lives. He clipped the flashlight to his jacket and tested the ladder. The metal groaned slightly, but held. Solid enough. He looked down at Shadow. You stay close. The German shepherd's tail moved once. Mason smiled faintly. Then he began climbing. The ladder descended much farther than he expected. 10 feet. 20. 30. The beam of light revealed concrete walls surrounding the shaft. Not rough construction. Professional construction. Expensive construction. Whoever built this place had known exactly what they were doing. At the bottom, Mason stepped onto a concrete floor. Shadow landed beside him moments later. The air felt cool and dry, not damp like a basement, not stale. The environment had somehow remained preserved. Mason slowly swept the flashlight across the darkness. At first he saw only shapes, massive shapes, covered shapes, rows of them. The beam continued moving. His heartbeat accelerated. The room seemed enormous, far larger than the garage above. Concrete support columns disappeared into darkness. The ceiling stretched overhead like an underground warehouse. The silence was absolute. Not even the wind reached down here. Then the flashlight landed on something unmistakable. A wheel. Chrome. Perfectly polished. Mason frowned. He stepped closer. The object sat beneath a fitted gray cover. Dust coated the fabric. But the shape underneath was unmistakable. A vehicle. What is this place? He whispered. Shadow moved quietly beside him. The dog seemed calmer now, as if the mystery that had bothered him was finally beginning to make sense. Mason reached for the cover. His hand hesitated. The moment felt strangely important, like opening a door into another life. Then he pulled. The fabric slid backward, and Mason froze. The vehicle beneath gleamed beneath the flashlight beam. Bright red paint, flawless curves, perfect chrome, not abandoned, not damaged, preserved, beautiful. Even someone who wasn't a car expert would recognize it instantly. A Ferrari. Mason stared in disbelief. The car looked as if it had rolled off a showroom floor yesterday, not hidden underground for decades. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he walked around it. No rust, no deterioration, nothing. Everything appeared immaculate. Then he noticed another covered vehicle nearby, and another, and another. Rows of them. Entire rows. His flashlight swept across the underground chamber. The beam illuminated dozens of covered silhouettes. Some large, some sleek, some unmistakably rare. A realization slowly settled over him. This wasn't a storage room. It wasn't a garage. It was a collection. An enormous collection. Mason approached the second vehicle. He removed the cover. A silver Mercedes. The third. A Shelby Cobra. The fourth. A vintage Porsche. The fifth. Something he didn't even recognize but knew immediately had to be valuable. His breathing became shallow. The deeper he walked into the chamber, the more incredible the discovery became. Every vehicle appeared pristine. Every vehicle appeared maintained. Every vehicle appeared intentionally preserved, as if someone had built an underground museum and simply walked away. Shadow followed beside him. His nails clicked softly against the concrete. The sounds echoed through the vast chamber. The dog occasionally sniffed the air, but remained close, protective, watchful. Mason stopped in the center of the room. His flashlight turned slowly. The beam reflected from chrome surfaces hidden beneath covers. Dozens, maybe more. The scale became overwhelming. He tried estimating the value, then stopped. It was impossible. Even he knew some of these vehicles must be worth fortunes. His attention shifted toward the far end of the underground facility. There, partially hidden behind a row of classic automobiles, stood something unexpected. An office. A real office. Glass walls, wooden door, furniture. Someone had spent serious money constructing this place. Mason moved toward it. The office appeared untouched. A desk sat beneath a hanging light fixture. Bookshelves lined the walls. File cabinets stood neatly organized. Dust covered everything. Yet nothing looked disturbed. The room felt frozen in time. On the desk rested a leather-bound notebook. Mason picked it up carefully. The cover was cracked with age. He opened it. Handwritten notes filled the pages. Precise handwriting, detailed records, dates, vehicle descriptions, maintenance logs, restoration notes. Mason flipped through several pages. The entries stretched back decades. The name appearing repeatedly at the top of each section was always the same. Walter Briggs. The name meant nothing to Mason, but clearly it had meant everything to this collection. He continued reading. The entries described engine rebuilds, rare acquisitions, parts searches, restoration projects, years of work, thousands of hours, a lifetime devoted to automobiles. Mason stopped on one page. His flashlight illuminated a line written in darker ink. Collection secured. Future protected. The words sent a strange chill through him. Protected from what? Protected from whom? Before he could think further, Shadow suddenly stiffened. Mason looked up immediately. The German shepherd wasn't growling, wasn't barking, just listening. The same way he had done countless times overseas, the same way he had done before danger. Mason's muscles tightened instinctively. His flashlight swept across the underground chamber. Nothing. Silence. Complete silence. After several tense moments, Shadow relaxed again. Mason exhaled. Old habits. Both of them still carried those. He sat slowly in the office chair. The reality of everything finally began settling in. Yesterday, he had been a homeless veteran sleeping in a truck. Today, he sat inside a hidden underground facility containing what appeared to be one of the greatest private automobile collections he had ever seen. The contrast felt unreal, impossible. His eyes moved across the vehicles, across the office, across the decades of work left behind by a man he had never met. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who was Walter Briggs? Why hide this collection? Why build an underground vault beneath an isolated garage? Why leave everything behind? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how much was all of this actually worth? Mason stood and walked toward one of the nearest vehicles. A small brass plaque sat beside it. He brushed away dust. The inscription became visible. 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO estimated value, $48 million. Mason stared, then read it again. $48 million for one car. One. His heartbeat thundered. Slowly he looked around the chamber, at the rows of vehicles, at the dozens of plaques, at the impossible collection surrounding him. A realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The underground vault wasn't worth millions. It was worth far more. Far, far more. The poorest man in Silver Creek stood in the middle of a hidden kingdom buried beneath a mountain. A kingdom worth over $100 million. And suddenly Mason understood something else. Discoveries like this never stay secret forever. Sooner or later, someone would come looking. The thought followed Mason Reed all the way back up the ladder. By the time he emerged into the garage, evening shadows had begun stretching across the snow-covered valley outside. The world looked exactly the same. The mountains remained silent. The wind drifted through the pine trees. The garage stood where it always had. Yet everything felt different. Mason paused beside the open hatch and looked around the building. A day earlier, it had been an abandoned property. Now it was the entrance to one of the most extraordinary discoveries imaginable. And nobody in Silver Creek knew. Not yet. Shadow climbed out beside him and shook dust from his coat. The dog seemed calmer now. The restless curiosity that had consumed him for days had finally eased. Whatever scent or instinct had drawn him to that corner, it had led them exactly where it was supposed to. Mason lowered the hatch carefully and concealed it beneath a tarp. He wasn't trying to hide the discovery forever. He simply needed time to think, time to understand what he had found, time to understand Walter Briggs. That night, snow fell steadily across Black Pine Road. The garage creaked softly as temperatures dropped. Mason sat alone inside the underground office. A battery-powered lantern illuminated the desk. Stacks of journals surrounded him. Leather-bound notebooks, folders, blueprint tubes, decades of records. The deeper he dug into Walter Briggs's life, the stranger the story became. The earliest journal entries were optimistic, almost joyful. Walter wrote about finding rare vehicles, restoring forgotten classics, searching junkyards, tracking parts across the country. The pages overflowed with passion. Mason could almost hear the excitement in the man's voice. One entry described driving across 3 states to purchase a damaged Shelby Cobra. Another detailed 6 years spent restoring a Ferrari engine. The collection hadn't been built by wealth alone. It had been built through obsession, patience, dedication, a life's work. Shadow rested beside the desk, occasionally lifting his head whenever Mason turned a page. The lantern cast long shadows across the office walls. Outside the glass windows sat rows of priceless automobiles sleeping beneath their covers. The entire underground vault felt like a hidden kingdom frozen in time. Mason continued reading. Then the tone of the journals began changing. Gradually at first, then dramatically. The cheerful entries disappeared. The writing grew tense, cautious, suspicious. Walter began mentioning visitors, businessmen, investors, developers, people interested in buying the collection. At first he seemed flattered, then increasingly uncomfortable. One entry made Mason pause. People see value. They do not see meaning. The words felt important. Mason turned the page. Another entry. Another warning. The collection must remain hidden. There are people who would destroy it for profit. A chill moved through him. The journals no longer sounded like the writings of a collector. They sounded like the writings of a man preparing for something. Someone. The deeper Mason read, the more troubled Walter appeared. Entire pages focused on secrecy, security, trust, betrayal. Then one name appeared repeatedly. Not fully, only initials. RV. Mason frowned. The initials surfaced again and again. Meetings with RV, arguments with RV. Disagreements over ownership. Threats. The entries never explained who the person was, only that Walter no longer trusted him. Shadow suddenly raised his head. Mason instinctively looked up. The dog listened quietly, a habit formed from years of working together. After a moment, Shadow relaxed again. The garage remained silent. Snow tapped gently against distant windows. Mason returned to the journals. Hours passed. The deeper he traveled into Walter's story, the more he felt as though he knew the man. Walter Briggs wasn't merely preserving cars. He believed he was preserving history. One journal described every vehicle as a chapter in America's story. Another described restoration work as a way of honoring the people who built them. The collection wasn't about money. It was about legacy. And somebody wanted it badly. Near midnight, Mason discovered a smaller notebook hidden inside a desk drawer. Unlike the others, this one contained no restoration notes, no technical records, only personal entries. The handwriting appeared shakier, older, more tired. Mason opened the first page. If you're reading this, then I've likely been gone for some time. His heartbeat quickened. The message felt direct, personal, as though Walter had somehow known another person would eventually sit at this desk. Mason kept reading. I've spent 40 years building this collection, not because I wanted wealth, but because I feared what would happen if these machines disappeared forever. The next pages revealed more. Walter never married, never had children. The collection had become his family, his purpose, his life's mission. Then came the part that changed everything. RV says I'm foolish for hiding it. He believes money should decide its future. He believes everything has a price. I disagree. Mason leaned back slowly. Again the initials, again the warning, again the conflict. Who was RV? The answer remained frustratingly out of reach. Several pages later, Walter's tone became darker, more urgent. I made a mistake trusting him. Now he believes the collection belongs to him. He doesn't understand. It never will. A cold sensation settled in Mason's stomach. Whatever had happened between Walter and RV, it clearly hadn't ended well. The final pages became increasingly fragmented. Sentences cut short. Ideas abandoned. The handwriting deteriorated. One entry contained only a single line. If anything happens to me, the collection must survive. Another. The future matters more than ownership. Then finally, the last complete entry. Mason read it twice, then a third time. I fear they will come sooner than expected. If they find this place, they will sell everything. The history, the craftsmanship, the story. Gone. All of it. If you're reading this, protect it. Please. The entry ended there. No signature. No date. Nothing else. The remaining pages were blank. Mason stared at them for a long time. The silence felt heavier now. Walter Briggs no longer seemed like a mysterious collector. He felt human. A lonely man who had spent decades protecting something he loved. A man who had become increasingly frightened near the end of his life. A man who apparently believed danger was coming. Mason closed the notebook. His thoughts drifted toward his own past, toward teammates who never came home, toward missions that ended badly, toward promises left unfinished, purpose, legacy, responsibility. Those words meant something to him, more than money ever could. Shadow rose and approached the office window. The dog stared into the darkness beyond the rows of cars, watching, listening, waiting. Mason followed his gaze. The vast underground chamber stretched into shadows. Hundreds of millions of dollars in history surrounded them. Yet the collection itself no longer felt like the biggest mystery. Walter Briggs was the mystery. Who was RV? Why had Walter become so afraid? And most importantly, what exactly had happened to him? As Mason stood there, another realization slowly formed. Discovering the collection was only the beginning. The real story was just starting, and somewhere in Silver Creek, or perhaps far beyond it, the answers were still waiting. The next morning dawned bright and cold. Fresh snow sparkled across the valley like scattered diamonds beneath the Colorado sun. For most people in Silver Creek, it was simply another winter morning. For Mason Reed, it felt like the beginning of something dangerous. He stood outside the garage holding a steaming cup of coffee. Shadow sat nearby, watching the tree line. The German Shepherd seemed unusually alert. More alert than usual. Mason had noticed it since discovering the underground vault. Almost as though Shadow understood what existed beneath them. As though the dog knew the secret needed protecting. Mason looked toward the mountains. The discovery still felt unreal. Part of him wondered if he had imagined it. Then he remembered the rows of cars, the journals, Walter Briggs, the hidden kingdom beneath his feet. No. It was real. Every bit of it. The problem was figuring out what came next. He couldn't simply pretend the collection didn't exist. At the same time, announcing it to the world felt reckless. He needed answers, legal answers, practical answers, questions about ownership, taxes, inheritance laws, property rights, questions far beyond his experience. Later that afternoon, he drove into town. The old pickup rattled down Main Street while snow melted from rooftops beneath bright sunlight. Silver Creek looked different than it had weeks ago. Not because the town had changed, because he had. Every passing building seemed connected to a future he hadn't imagined before. A future that might finally be larger than survival. Shadow occupied the passenger seat. His head rested near the window. People smiled when they saw the dog. Children pointed. A few waved. The German Shepherd had become something of a local celebrity. Mason parked near the county records office. The building stood beside the courthouse. A simple brick structure with a flag fluttering overhead. Inside, the warmth smelled faintly of paper and coffee. He spent nearly 2 hours researching property records. Walter Briggs's name appeared repeatedly. Garage permits, land transfers, tax documents, maintenance filings. The records stretched back decades, but they revealed surprisingly little. Walter had lived quietly, worked alone, avoided attention. The perfect man to hide a secret. One elderly clerk eventually approached. "You looking into Briggs?" Mason glanced up. "Maybe." The woman smiled. "Haven't heard that name in years." "You knew him?" "Everybody knew him." She leaned against the counter. Strange man, brilliant mechanic, kept to himself. "What happened to him?" The woman's expression softened. "He passed away nearly 15 years ago." Mason frowned. "No family?" She shook her head. "None that anyone knew about." "Interesting. Very interesting." The woman hesitated, then added something unexpected. Although there was one man always hanging around near the end. Mason immediately paid attention. "Who?" The clerk thought for a moment. "Developer from Denver, I think." "Name?" Her eyes narrowed as she searched her memory. Then she snapped her fingers. "Vance." Mason felt a small chill. Vance. The initials from the journals surfaced instantly. R.V. Russell. Vance? Could it really be that simple? The woman nodded. Russell Vance. That's it. Mason thanked her and left. Outside, cold wind swept through town. His thoughts raced. The coincidence felt too strong, too precise. Walter's journals repeatedly mentioned someone identified only as now records connected Walter Briggs to a man named Russell Vance, a man who still lived, a man who apparently remained wealthy and influential. The puzzle pieces were beginning to align. Unfortunately, the answers arrived much sooner than Mason expected. Because when he returned to Black Pine Road that evening, he found a black luxury SUV parked outside the garage. Mason immediately slowed the truck. His instincts activated. Shadow noticed it too. The dog sat upright instantly, focused, alert, watching. A tall man stood near the garage entrance, expensive overcoat, silver hair, confident posture, the kind of confidence money often creates. As Mason parked, the man smiled warmly, too warmly. "Mr. Reed?" Mason stepped from the truck. "Who's asking?" The man extended a hand. Russell Vance. The name hit like a warning bell. Mason shook his hand carefully. The grip felt practiced, polished, calculated, not sincere. "Can I help you?" Mason asked. Vance smiled again. "I hear you've purchased quite an interesting property." Mason remained silent. Years of military experience taught him the value of silence. People often revealed more when allowed to keep talking. Vance certainly did. "I've had an interest in this area for years." His eyes drifted briefly toward the garage. Particularly this garage. That caught Mason's attention. "Why?" Vance chuckled. "Local history fascinates me." Shadow growled softly, barely audible, but unmistakable. Vance glanced downward. The smile never left his face, yet something changed in his eyes. A flicker, a momentary irritation. Then it vanished. "Beautiful dog." Mason scratched behind Shadow's ears. The German Shepherd remained between them, protective, still growling quietly. A rare reaction. Shadow normally liked people. The dog disliked this man immediately. That mattered. Mason trusted Shadow's judgment, perhaps more than his own. Vance casually reached into his coat pocket. He produced a business card. "Would you consider selling the property?" The question arrived far too quickly. Mason took the card, looked at it, then looked back up. "Not really. Everyone has a number." "No." Vance's smile tightened slightly. "Perhaps you should hear my offer first." Mason folded the card, slipped it into his pocket. "I'm listening." The developer's eyes gleamed. $1 million. Silence settled between them. Even the wind seemed to pause. $1 million. The number should have been life-changing. It should have stunned him. Months earlier, Mason would have accepted before Vance finished speaking. Now something felt wrong. Very wrong. $1 million was a huge amount of money. But not if someone knew about the collection. Not if someone understood what was hidden underground. And suddenly Mason understood something important. Russell Vance wasn't buying a garage. He was buying access. Buying secrecy. Buying control. Shadow's growl deepened. Vance glanced at the dog again. This time the irritation became harder to hide. Mason noticed. The pieces continued falling into place. "You seem awfully interested in this property." Vance laughed softly. "Business opportunity." "No." Mason met his eyes. Something else. The smile faded completely, only for a second, but it was enough. Mason saw it. The mask slipping, the real man underneath. Cold, patient, determined. Then the smile returned. Perfectly polished. Perfectly false. "Think about the offer," Vance said. He turned toward the SUV. Before climbing inside, he paused. "Mr. Reed." Mason waited. Some opportunities only come once. The words sounded friendly, yet something beneath them felt very different, almost like a warning. Then Vance drove away. The black SUV disappeared down Black Pine Road. Snow swirled behind it. Mason stood motionless. Shadow remained beside him, watching until the vehicle vanished completely. Only then did the dog relax slightly. Mason looked toward the garage, toward the hidden vault beneath it, toward Walter Briggs's journals, toward the repeated warnings, the collection, the secrecy, the fear, the initials, RV. For the first time, Walter Briggs's concerns felt real, very real. And now Mason faced a difficult truth. If Russell Vance had found him this quickly, others might not be far behind. That realization stayed with Mason Reed throughout the following week. Winter tightened its grip on Silver Creek. Snowstorms rolled through the mountains one after another. The forests surrounding Black Pine Road became silent seas of white. The garage stood alone against the weather, isolated beneath dark pines and towering ridgelines. Yet for the first time since buying the property, Mason no longer felt alone. He felt watched. Not constantly, not obviously. Just enough. A vehicle parked too long at a distant overlook. A pair of tire tracks appearing near the property line. Questions from strangers in town. Small things. The kind most people ignored. The kind Mason had been trained to notice. The former SEAL trusted his instincts, and his instincts were growing louder every day. Shadow noticed it too. The German Shepherd had become increasingly protective. His patrols around the property grew longer. His ears remained alert. His attention rarely drifted. One afternoon, Mason was repairing a broken window frame when Shadow suddenly froze. The dog stared toward the road. Mason followed his gaze. A dark SUV sat briefly near the entrance, far enough away to seem casual, close enough to observe. After several seconds, it drove away. No explanation, no interaction, just observation. Mason watched until it disappeared. The knot in his stomach tightened. That evening, he called the number on Russell Vance's business card. The developer answered immediately, almost as if he had been expecting the call. "Mr. Reed, you seem very interested in my garage." A short pause, then a smooth chuckle. "I'm interested in opportunities. You've been watching the property." "No." The answer came too quickly, too cleanly. Mason recognized rehearsed dishonesty, the same way he once recognized danger. The conversation ended politely, yet neither man believed the other. After hanging up, Mason sat quietly inside the underground office. Walter Briggs's journals lay spread across the desk. The lantern cast warm light across old pages. Shadow rested nearby. Outside the office windows, rows of priceless automobiles slept beneath their covers. A hidden kingdom, a secret worth protecting. Mason turned another page. One passage immediately caught his attention. "If they ever discover the entrance, they'll come at night." The words made him stop. He read them again. Then a third time. Walter had written those words years before his death. The sentence felt less like a journal entry and more like a warning. Mason looked toward the office door, toward the underground chamber beyond, toward the ladder leading back to the garage. The feeling returned, that quiet pressure in his chest. Something was coming. He just didn't know when. The answer arrived 3 nights later. Snow fell heavily across Black Pine Road. Wind howled through the trees. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The storm transformed the mountains into a world of darkness and white shadows. Most people in Silver Creek stayed indoors. The roads were nearly empty. Shortly after midnight, Mason woke suddenly. His eyes opened instantly. No nightmare, no flashback. Just instinct. Years of training. The same invisible alarm that had saved his life countless times. For several seconds, he remained still, listening. The garage was dark, the office silent. Then he noticed something. Shadow wasn't sleeping. The German Shepherd stood near the office doorway. Rigid, focused, listening. Every muscle in the dog's body looked tense. Mason quietly sat up. His pulse accelerated. "What is it?" he whispered. Shadow's ears remained fixed toward the main garage. Then came the sound. Faint. Metal. Barely audible beneath the wind. Someone was outside. Mason moved immediately. His military instincts took over. Calm. Controlled. Focused. He switched off the lantern. Darkness swallowed the office. Then he quietly climbed toward the garage above. Shadow remained directly beside him. The storm masked many sounds, but not all. Once inside the garage, Mason heard it again. A metallic clink near the side entrance. Someone was attempting to force the door. His heart pounded. Not from fear, from certainty. Walter had been right. Someone had come. Another sound. The lock gave way. The side door opened. Cold air rushed inside. Mason remained hidden behind old shelving. Shadow crouched silently beside him. The dog didn't bark, didn't move, waiting for a command. 3 figures entered the garage. Heavy coats, flashlights, gloved hands, not random thieves. They moved with purpose. One flashlight swept across the room. Another studied the floor. The third man walked directly toward the welding station, toward the hidden hatch. Mason felt ice run through his veins. They knew exactly where to look. The men exchanged quiet words, then began moving equipment, searching, working. The hidden entrance would eventually be discovered. The realization hit hard. This wasn't about theft anymore. Someone had already learned enough to find the vault. Shadow looked at Mason, waiting. The former SEAL made a decision. He stepped forward. Looking for something? The flashlight swung instantly. The intruders froze. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one man cursed. The situation exploded into motion. The intruders rushed toward the side exit, not wanting confrontation, wanting escape. But in their panic, one of them shoved over a heavy steel cabinet. The cabinet crashed toward Mason. Shadow reacted before anyone else. The German Shepherd launched forward. The impact changed direction. The cabinet struck the floor beside Mason instead of directly on him. The crash echoed through the garage. One of the fleeing men stumbled. Another dropped a flashlight. Within seconds, all 3 disappeared into the storm. Their vehicle roared to life somewhere beyond the trees, then vanished. Silence returned. Only the wind remained. Mason's breathing slowly steadied. The danger had passed. Then he noticed Shadow. The dog wasn't beside him. A sharp whine broke the silence. Mason turned. His heart dropped. Shadow stood several feet away, favoring one front leg. Blood stained the fur near his shoulder. Not severe, but unmistakable. The cabinet had clipped him during the impact. The dog had taken the blow while protecting his owner. No. Mason crossed the room immediately. Shadow tried to stand normally, tried to pretend everything was fine. The same stubborn courage Mason had seen during deployments. The same loyalty that never wavered. Mason knelt beside him. His hands shook slightly. The sight hit harder than he expected, harder than discovering the collection, harder than confronting intruders, harder than any threat. Because for years, Shadow had been the one constant in a life full of loss. The dog had survived combat, survived retirement, survived homelessness, survived every dark chapter beside him. And now he was hurt because of this secret, because of this collection, because someone wanted what lay hidden beneath the garage. Mason gently rested a hand on the dog's neck. "It's okay, buddy." But the words felt hollow, because deep down he knew something had changed. This was no longer a mystery, no longer a treasure hunt, no longer an incredible discovery. It was a fight. And whoever wanted Walter Briggs's hidden kingdom had just proven how far they were willing to go to get it. Snow continued falling through the remainder of the night. The storm wrapped Black Pine Road in darkness and silence. Inside the garage, Mason Reed knelt beside Shadow. The German shepherd stood stubbornly despite the pain. Blood stained the fur along his shoulder. Not a life-threatening wound, but serious enough to demand immediate attention. Mason carefully examined the injury using a flashlight. The steel cabinet had struck the dog during the chaos. A deep cut ran beneath the thick coat. His stomach tightened. Shadow had protected him without hesitation. Again, just like he always had. The same dog who had stood beside him in foreign deserts. The same dog who had stayed beside him during sleepless nights in a freezing truck. The same dog who had never once walked away. Now Shadow was injured because of him. Because of the garage. Because of the collection. Because Mason had uncovered a secret someone desperately wanted. "We're getting you help." His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Shadow nudged his hand. Even injured, the dog seemed more concerned about Mason than himself. That nearly broke him. The roads were dangerous. The storm was worsening. But waiting wasn't an option. Within minutes, Mason had loaded Shadow into the truck. The old Ford fought through deep snow as they headed toward Silver Creek. The windshield wipers struggled against the storm. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Headlights illuminated only swirling white. The drive felt endless. Every few minutes, Mason glanced toward the passenger seat. Shadow remained awake, watching him, always watching him, as though making sure Mason was still okay. By the time they reached town, dawn was beginning to creep over the mountains. The veterinary clinic sat near the edge of Silver Creek, a small building surrounded by snow-covered pine trees. The lights were already on. Mason carried Shadow inside. The receptionist immediately called for help. Minutes later, the dog disappeared through treatment doors, and Mason was left alone. Waiting. The waiting was the worst part. It always had been. Hospitals, medical tents, emergency rooms. Waiting brought back memories. Memories he spent years trying to outrun. The clinic waiting room sat quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, old ghosts returned. Mason leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the floor. Suddenly, he wasn't in Colorado anymore. He wasn't in Silver Creek. He wasn't sitting inside a veterinary clinic. He was somewhere else, somewhere far away. The memory arrived without warning. Dust, heat, radio chatter, gunfire in the distance. One of his teammates smiling moments before everything changed. Mason squeezed his eyes shut. Not now. But PTSD didn't ask permission. The memory continued. Faces, voices, names. Men who never made it home. Men he still carried with him every day. The familiar guilt settled over him. Heavy, unwelcome, persistent. Why them? Why not me? The question had haunted him for years. The answer never came. A gentle voice interrupted the spiral. "Mr. Reed?" Mason looked up. A veterinarian stood nearby. Middle-aged, kind eyes, tired smile, the expression doctors wear when delivering difficult news carefully. Mason immediately stood. "How is he?" The veterinarian smiled. "He's going to be okay." Relief hit so hard Mason nearly lost his balance. His knees weakened. The room suddenly felt brighter, warmer. Breath returned to his lungs. The doctor continued. "The injury looks worse than it is. He needed stitches. He'll need rest, but he'll recover." Recover. The word felt like a gift. For the first time in hours, Mason allowed himself to breathe. "Can I see him?" "Of course." A few minutes later, Mason entered the recovery room. Shadow lay on a blanket. Bandages wrapped around his shoulder. The dog's eyes immediately opened. His tail thumped weakly against the floor. Mason knelt beside him. The German shepherd lifted his head. The sight finally shattered something inside him. Not dramatically, not loudly, quietly, the way real heartbreak often happens. He rested his forehead against Shadow's, and suddenly all the walls he'd spent years building began to crack. The nightmares, the loneliness, the failures, the months living out of a truck, the teammates he'd buried, the marriage he'd lost, the purpose he'd struggled to find. All of it surfaced at once. For years, Mason had convinced himself he was fine. Not good, not happy, just functional. Now, looking at the dog who had risked himself without hesitation, he realized how fragile that illusion truly was. A tear rolled down his cheek, then another. Shadow simply stayed there, calm, present, the way he always had, the way he always would. For a long time, neither moved, neither needed to. Later that afternoon, after the storm finally eased, Mason stepped outside the clinic. The mountains surrounding Silver Creek gleamed beneath fresh snow. The storm had passed. Everything looked clean, bright, almost peaceful. A woman approached from the parking lot. Dark coat, leather briefcase, confident stride. Mason recognized her immediately. Grace Holloway, the attorney whose name appeared on half the legal signs around town. She stopped beside him. "I heard about the break-in." Mason frowned. "How? In a town this size?" "News travels fast." She studied him for a moment, then looked through the clinic window toward Shadow. "How's your dog?" "Recovering." "Good." For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Grace surprised him. "Russell Vance paid me a visit yesterday." Mason's attention sharpened instantly. What did he want? She gave a humorless smile. "He wanted to know whether I'd represent you if legal issues came up." That answer told Mason everything. Vance wasn't waiting anymore. He was preparing. Grace adjusted her scarf against the cold. "Mr. Reed, I've dealt with Russell Vance before. Is he dangerous?" She considered the question carefully. "He's powerful." Not the same answer, but perhaps a more honest one. The attorney looked directly at him. "If he's interested in your property, then whatever you found out there is worth more than money." Mason remained silent. Grace didn't press. Smart people rarely do. Instead, she handed him a business card. "If things get complicated, call me." Then she walked away, leaving Mason alone with his thoughts. That evening, he returned to the garage. Shadow remained at the clinic overnight for observation. The building felt emptier without him. Too quiet, too large. Mason wandered through the main workspace, past the welding station, past the hidden hatch, past the rows of forgotten tools. The absence of the dog weighed heavily on him. For years, Shadow had been the one constant in every chapter of his life. Without him, the loneliness returned quickly. Eventually, Mason descended into the underground vault. The hidden kingdom waited exactly as before. Silent. Patient. Rows of priceless automobiles rested beneath their covers. Walter Briggs' office remained untouched. The journals sat where he had left them. Yet everything felt different now. The collection no longer seemed exciting. It seemed expensive. Not in dollars. In consequences. The hidden treasure had already cost Shadow blood. What would it cost next? Mason sat alone at Walter's desk. The lantern illuminated the final journal. His eyes settled on a sentence he had overlooked before. A sentence written near the end of Walter's life. The things worth protecting always require sacrifice. Mason stared at the words. Long after the lantern flame stopped flickering, long after darkness settled around him, because for the first time, he truly understood what Walter Briggs had meant. The things worth protecting always require sacrifice. The sentence stayed with Mason Reed throughout the night. He sat alone inside Walter Briggs's underground office while the lantern burned low. The vast chamber beyond the glass walls remained silent. Rows of priceless automobiles rested beneath their covers like sleeping giants. For weeks, Mason had viewed the collection as a mystery, then as a fortune, then as a target. Now he was beginning to see it differently, as a responsibility. By dawn, he finally climbed back to the garage. The storm had passed. Fresh sunlight spilled across the mountains surrounding Black Pine Road. The world looked renewed, clean, bright, hopeful. It contrasted sharply with the conflict building beneath the surface. Mason drove into Silver Creek before noon. His first stop was the veterinary clinic. The moment Shadow saw him, the German shepherd's tail began thumping against the floor. The sight immediately lifted a weight from Mason's chest. The bandages remained. The stitches remained. But the dog was healing. That was enough. "You're supposed to be resting," Mason said quietly. Shadow ignored the advice and pushed his head against Mason's chest. The veterinarian laughed softly. "I've treated a lot of dogs," she smiled, "but this one doesn't know how to quit." Mason scratched behind Shadow's ears. "Neither do I." An hour later, Shadow was finally cleared to leave. The veterinarian insisted on limited activity. Shadow disagreed. Strongly. The moment they returned to the garage, the German shepherd resumed his unofficial patrol. Slower than before, more carefully, but determined. Watching him stirred something inside Mason. Purpose. The same purpose he once felt protecting people beside teammates he trusted. That feeling had been missing for years. Now it was returning. Late that afternoon, another visitor arrived. A weathered pickup rolled into the property. An older man stepped out. Heavy coat, gray beard, steady eyes. The kind of man who looked comfortable in both silence and storms. Mason recognized him immediately. Deputy Cole Mercer. Retired now, but still one of the most respected men in Silver Creek. The former deputy removed his hat. "Heard somebody caused trouble out here." Mason nodded. "Word travels fast." Cole smiled. "In this town?" "Faster than the internet." The two men sat outside beneath the pale winter sun. Shadow rested nearby. The old deputy listened carefully while Mason explained everything. Not the collection. Not yet. Just the break-in. The suspicious vehicles. Russell Vance, the coup. The growing pressure. Cole remained quiet for a long time. Then he said something unexpected. "Russell Vance has been buying property around here for 15 years. Mason looked up. "Why?" "Development." Cole shrugged. Hotels, resorts, luxury cabins. The deputy's expression darkened slightly. Not everybody's happy about it. That didn't surprise Mason. The old mountain town clearly valued its identity. Developers often valued profits. Sometimes those goals collided. "Have you ever heard of Walter Briggs?" Mason asked. Cole's eyes narrowed. Now there was recognition. "Sure." "You knew him?" "Knew of him." The retired deputy leaned back. Briggs was a genius with engines. His gaze drifted toward the mountains. People used to bring cars from 3 states away just to have him work on them. "Interesting." "Very interesting." "Did he know Russell Vance?" Cole's expression changed immediately. A small shift, but Mason noticed. The deputy nodded slowly, toward the end. "What happened?" Cole hesitated, then sighed. "Depends who you ask." The answer only increased Mason's curiosity. The retired deputy stood. "If you start digging into Walter Briggs, be careful what you find." "Why?" Cole looked toward the garage, toward the mountains, toward something only he could see. Then he quietly replied, "Some old stories never stay buried." That evening, after Cole left, Mason returned underground, this time with a different objective. The journals. He needed to understand the full story. Walter Briggs hadn't hidden a $100 million collection without reason. There had to be more. Far more. The deeper he searched, the more organized Walter's records became. Folders, maps, technical drawings, restoration notes, financial statements. Everything carefully preserved. Walter had documented nearly every year of his life. Then, buried inside a locked filing cabinet, Mason discovered something new. Blueprints. Dozens of them. Not for automobiles, for buildings, community centers, training facilities, workshops, educational programs. The discovery made no sense. At first. Then Mason found another folder, and another. Soon, documents covered the desk. Detailed plans, business proposals, letters, budgets, scholarship programs, veteran support initiatives, trade schools, community restoration projects. Mason stared in disbelief. This wasn't merely a car collection. It never had been. The vehicles were only part of something much larger. Walter Briggs had a plan. A very specific plan. And suddenly everything began fitting together. The collection wasn't intended to make someone rich. It was intended to fund something. Something enormous. Something lasting. Mason opened another folder. Inside sat a handwritten letter, addressed simply for whoever finds this. His pulse quickened. The handwriting was unmistakably Walter's. He began reading. "If you've found the collection, then you've also inherited a choice. A choice I struggled with for years. The vehicles have value, but value alone means nothing. Money disappears. Purpose survives." Mason read every word carefully. The letter explained everything. Walter wanted the collection converted into a foundation dedicated to veterans, tradesmen, working families, communities abandoned by industry, communities like Silver Creek, communities forgotten by progress. The automobiles were never meant to sit hidden forever. They were meant to become a future. A second chance. A legacy. Mason slowly lowered the letter. His eyes drifted toward the rows of covered vehicles. Suddenly, the collection looked different. Not like treasure, like tools. Tools capable of changing lives, tools capable of creating opportunities, tools capable of helping people who had been forgotten. People like him. Then he found the final piece. A newspaper clipping tucked inside the folder. Old, yellowed, nearly 30 years old. The headline immediately caught his attention. Local investor group attempts partnership with Briggs collection Projecta. Projecta photograph accompanied the article. Several men stood beside Walter Briggs. One face instantly stood out, younger, but unmistakable. Russell Vance. Mason felt his heartbeat accelerate. The article described a failed business partnership. Investors wanted control. Walter refused. The project collapsed. The article ended there, but Walter's notes continued, written angrily across the margin. They never understood. They only saw money, not purpose. Everything suddenly made sense. The journals, the warnings, the fear, the secrecy. Russell Vance hadn't appeared randomly. He hadn't suddenly become interested in the garage. He had been connected to this story for decades. And if Walter's notes were accurate, Russell's interest had never been about preserving history. It had always been about controlling it. Mason sat back slowly. The puzzle pieces finally formed a picture. A dangerous picture. A powerful man wanted the collection. Walter Briggs spent years protecting it from him. Now Walter was gone. And Mason stood between Russell Vance and $100 million legacy. Shadow approached quietly. The German shepherd rested his head against Mason's knee. Mason smiled faintly. For the first time since discovering the vault, uncertainty began giving way to determination. Walter Briggs had left behind more than automobiles. He had left behind a mission. And somewhere deep inside, Mason realized he was no longer trying to decide what to do. He had already decided. The collection would not become another rich man's prize, because it was never meant for one person. It was meant to help thousands. And for the first time since returning home from war, Mason Reed finally had something worth fighting for again. The feeling stayed with him through the following days. The mountains around Silver Creek seemed different somehow. Not because they had changed, because he had. For years, Mason had drifted through life without direction. One day blending into the next, survival replacing purpose. Now every morning carried meaning, every decision mattered, every step felt connected to something larger than himself. Walter Briggs's vision, the future of the collection, the people it could help, the veterans who might someday find opportunity because one stubborn mechanic had refused to sell. But purpose rarely arrives without opposition. And Russell Vance wasn't finished. 3 days after discovering Walter's plans, Mason found a legal notice taped to the garage door. The paper fluttered in the winter wind. Formal language, official seals, attorneys' names, property ownership dispute. Mason read it twice, then a third time. Vance was challenging the transfer of ownership, claiming the garage sale had involved irregularities, questioning the validity of the auction, questioning the chain of title, questioning everything. A black SUV sat parked at the end of the road while Mason read. Watching. Always watching. Shadow stood beside him. The German shepherd's ears de chameau flattened slightly. The dog clearly recognized the vehicle. Mason crumpled the notice in his hand, then reached for his phone. Grace Holloway answered on the second ring. Tell me he didn't. He did. A sigh came through the speaker. Meet me in town. That afternoon, Mason sat across from Grace inside her law office. Snow drifted outside the windows. The attorney studied the legal notice carefully. Not surprised. Not worried. Just focused. He doesn't have much. Mason raised an eyebrow. Then why file it? Grace leaned back. Because powerful people understand pressure. She placed the notice on her desk. He doesn't need to win immediately. He just needs to make your life difficult. Mason nodded. That sounded exactly right. The strategy wasn't legal. It was psychological. Delay. Pressure. expense exhaustion. Eventually, most people gave up, especially people without resources, especially people like Mason. Grace folded her hands. The problem is we need stronger evidence. We already have Walter's journals. Good evidence. She nodded. But not enough. What would be enough? Grace thought for a moment. Something definitive. Original ownership documents, recorded statements, legal instructions, anything proving Walter's intentions beyond doubt. Mason immediately thought of the underground office, the hidden files, the locked cabinets. There had to be more. There had to be. That evening, he returned to Black Pine Road, determined to search every inch of Walter Briggs's kingdom. The garage stood silent beneath a pale sunset. Snow reflected gold and orange light across the valley. Shadow moved more comfortably now. The stitches remained, but the dog had recovered much of his strength. The veterinarian would not have approved of what happened next. The German shepherd immediately resumed investigating the underground vault. Room by room, wall by wall, as if he sensed something remained hidden. Mason spent hours searching. Cabinets, shelves, drawers, storage rooms, the office. Nothing. Midnight arrived, then 1 o'clock. Frustration slowly replaced optimism. Maybe Grace was wrong. Maybe Walter had left nothing else. Maybe the journals were all that remained. Then Shadow stopped. The dog stood near the rear wall of the underground office, perfectly still. Mason looked up. The behavior felt familiar. Very familiar. It was the same posture, the same focus, the same determination, the exact behavior that had led them to the hatch beneath the garage floor. What is it? Shadow moved closer to the wall, sniffed, paused, then looked directly at Mason. The former SEAL smiled despite himself. You found something again, didn't you? Shadow placed one paw against the wooden paneling. Once, twice, then waited. Mason stood. His pulse quickened. The office wall appeared ordinary. Bookshelves, wood paneling, nothing unusual. Yet he had learned never to ignore Shadow's instincts. The dog had already uncovered one impossible secret. Perhaps he had found another. Mason examined the wall carefully. Several minutes passed. Then he noticed it. A tiny gap, almost invisible. A faint seam hidden between two wooden panels. His heartbeat accelerated. He pressed against it. Nothing. Then he searched nearby. Eventually, his fingers found a small brass latch hidden behind a shelf. The mechanism clicked. A section of wall shifted inward. Mason stepped back. Another hidden compartment. Another secret. The panel opened slowly. Inside sat a narrow room barely larger than a closet. Dust covered everything. No one had entered in years, perhaps decades. A small desk occupied the center. Several metal lockboxes rested on shelves, and mounted to one wall sat an old recording device. Mason stared. Walter Briggs had hidden an entire room inside his hidden office. The discovery felt surreal. Shadow entered first. The dog inspected the space briefly, then sat down. Mission accomplished. Again. Mason opened the nearest lockbox. Inside lay stacks of documents, property records, contracts, letters, financial records, exactly the type of evidence Grace had described. The next box contained more, and more. Then he opened the final lockbox. His breath caught. Inside rested a collection of sealed envelopes, each carefully labeled. One name appeared repeatedly. Russell Vance. Mason sat down immediately. The letters detailed years of conflict. Partnership proposals, investment offers, legal threats, attempts to gain control of the collection. Walter had documented everything, every conversation, every dispute, every warning. The deeper Mason read, the clearer the picture became. Russell Vance hadn't merely wanted access to the collection. He had wanted ownership. For decades. Then Mason noticed the recording device. A cassette remained inside. A handwritten label covered the front. If necessary. The words immediately caught his attention. With shaking hands, Mason connected power to the machine. The tape whirred softly. Static filled the room. Then a voice emerged. Old. Tired. Steady. Walter Briggs. If you're hearing this recording, then events unfolded exactly as I feared. Mason froze. The dead man's voice echoed through the hidden chamber. Walter continued. I am making this statement voluntarily and under no pressure. The recording sounded formal, intentional, legal. The kind of statement people make when preparing for the future. The kind lawyers love. The kind judges trust. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Russell Vance and his associates have repeatedly attempted to obtain control of my collection against my wishes. Mason sat motionless. Every word mattered. Every sentence carried weight. Walter calmly described years of pressure, manipulation, threats, attempts to force a sale. Then came the final declaration. My collection shall never belong to Russell Vance, his family, or any business entity connected to him. Silence followed. Then the recording ended. The tape clicked softly. Nothing more. Mason stared at the machine. His heart pounded. Walter Briggs had just reached across time and handed him exactly what he needed. Proof. Real proof. Not suspicion. Not theory. Evidence. The kind that changes courtrooms. The kind that destroys lies. The kind that powerful people fear. Shadow approached quietly. The German shepherd rested his head against Mason's arm. Mason smiled. A genuine smile. Because once again, the dog had found what everyone else missed. And somewhere across Silver Creek, Russell Vance still believed he controlled the game. He had no idea the board had just changed. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. By Monday morning, the entire town knew about it. Silver Creek had always been a place where news traveled faster than winter storms. People discussed it over coffee at Millie's Cafe, at the hardware store, at church, at the gas station. Everywhere. Some believed Mason Reed was protecting something valuable. Others believed Russell Vance's version of events, that the former Navy SEAL had stumbled into property that never truly belonged to him. Rumors multiplied. Speculation grew. The town slowly divided into camps, and for the first time since buying the garage, Mason found himself standing at the center of attention, a position he hated. The attention triggered old instincts, old discomfort, crowds, questions, whispers. His PTSD made all of it exhausting. But this time he couldn't disappear, because disappearing would mean surrendering, and surrendering would betray Walter Briggs. It would betray Shadow. It would betray everyone who might someday benefit from the foundation. So Mason stayed and prepared. The days leading to the hearing became a blur. Grace Holloway transformed Walter's evidence into a legal weapon. Every document was copied, every letter cataloged, every recording transcribed. The attorney worked with relentless precision. Meanwhile, Deputy Cole Mercer quietly helped gather supporting witnesses, people who remembered Walter, people who remembered Russell, people who remembered conflicts stretching back decades. One evening, Grace spread dozens of files across a conference table. Snow drifted beyond the office windows. Silver Creek glowed beneath winter darkness. We have enough. Mason looked up. You sound confident. I am. That answer surprised him. Grace wasn't the type to offer confidence lightly. She tapped Walter's recorded statement. This changes everything. Then she pointed to the old letters. And these finish the job. Mason nodded. Yet something still bothered him. Russell Vance wasn't foolish. The developer had spent decades building influence, power, connections. Men like that rarely entered battles they expected to lose. What am I missing? Mason asked. Grace studied him carefully. You're expecting him to play fair. The answer landed hard. Because she was right. The hearing wouldn't simply be about facts. It would be about perception, influence, control. And Russell Vance had plenty of both. The hearing arrived beneath clear skies. The storm clouds that had dominated winter finally vanished. Sunlight reflected brilliantly from fresh snow. The courthouse stood at the center of town, its brick walls gleaming beneath the morning light. By the time Mason arrived, dozens of people had already gathered. More continued arriving every minute. Locals, reporters, business owners, retirees, veterans, curious residents. Everyone wanted to witness the confrontation. Shadow walked beside Mason, fully recovered now. The stitches had been removed. The injury remained visible beneath his fur, a permanent reminder of what the collection had already cost. As Mason approached the courthouse steps, several people nodded respectfully. Something had changed. Weeks earlier, most barely noticed him. Now they knew his name, his story, his fight. Inside, the hearing room filled quickly. Every seat occupied. People lined the walls. The atmosphere felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a showdown. Russell Vance sat confidently at one table. Expensive suit, perfect posture, calm smile. Several attorneys surrounded him. The image of success, the image of control. Then there was Mason. Simple jacket, weathered boots, Shadow resting quietly at his feet. The contrast couldn't have been greater. Yet strangely, Mason no longer felt intimidated, because truth sat on his side of the room, and truth had weight. The proceedings began shortly after 10. The judge listened patiently as Russell's attorneys spoke first. They challenged the auction, questioned ownership, raised procedural concerns, suggested uncertainty, nothing unexpected. Grace took notes without interruption, waiting, watching, the way a hunter waits for the right moment. Nearly an hour passed. Then finally the judge turned toward her, Ms. Holloway. Grace stood. Everything changed. She moved with calm confidence. No drama, no theatrics, just facts. One by one she dismantled Russell's claims, property records, auction documents, county filings. The foundation of their case slowly crumbled. Then she introduced Walter Briggs's letters. The room grew quieter. She introduced the financial records. The silence deepened. Then she introduced the hidden recordings. The silence became complete. Walter Briggs's voice filled the courtroom. Even decades later, the words carried power. Russell Vance and his associates have repeatedly attempted to obtain control of my collection against my wishes. Several people exchanged glances. Others leaned forward. The recording continued. Detailed, specific, undeniable. Mason watched Russell carefully. For the first time, the developer's confidence wavered. Only slightly. But enough. Grace wasn't finished. The letters followed. Then the partnership documents. Then the rejected proposals. Each piece revealed the same pattern. Russell wanted control. Walter refused. Again, and again, and again. The story became impossible to ignore. The courtroom felt different now. The momentum had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Then Grace delivered the final blow. Walter's foundation plans, scholarship programs, veteran initiatives, trade schools, community investments, the true purpose of the collection. The room fell silent once more, because suddenly this wasn't about automobiles. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't even about ownership. It was about legacy. The contrast became stark. Walter Briggs had envisioned opportunity. Russell Vance had envisioned profit. One wanted to build, the other wanted to possess. The difference mattered, and everyone in the room understood it. The judge called for a brief recess. People immediately began talking, whispering, reacting. Reporters hurried toward hallways. Phones appeared. Messages spread. The story was no longer private. It belonged to the town now. During the break, Mason stepped outside. The cold air felt refreshing. Snow sparkled across the courthouse lawn. Shadow stood beside him. The German shepherd looked toward the mountains, toward Black Pine Road, toward the hidden kingdom that had started everything. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Looks like your dog was right." Mason turned. Deputy Cole Mercer smiled. The old lawman nodded toward Shadow. He found more than a hidden room. Mason glanced at the dog. "Yeah." Cole's smile widened. He found the truth. The second half of the hearing lasted less than an hour, because by then the outcome had become obvious. Russell's attorneys tried recovering ground, tried creating doubt, tried redirecting attention. Nothing worked. The evidence was too strong, too complete, too honest. When the judge finally delivered the ruling, the room became silent enough to hear people breathing. The decision came quickly. The auction remained valid. Ownership remained with Mason Reed. Walter Briggs's documented intentions would be protected. Any future foundation could proceed. Russell Vance's claims were dismissed, just like that. Years of manipulation collapsed. Decades of pursuit ended. The room erupted, not chaotically, but emotionally. People smiled. Some applauded despite courtroom etiquette. Others simply looked relieved. Grace sat down slowly. Victory never changed her expression much, yet even she couldn't hide a small smile. Across the room, Russell Vance remained motionless. The developer stared at the evidence spread across the tables. The empire he built through influence had finally encountered something stronger: truth. Investigators waiting outside approached his legal team almost immediately. Additional questions, additional inquiries, additional problems. The consequences were only beginning. As people filed from the courthouse, Mason remained seated. For a long moment, he simply absorbed it. The fight was over. The collection was safe. Walter's vision survived. Shadow nudged his hand gently. Mason smiled, not because he had defeated Russell Vance, because something far more important had happened. For the first time in years, he no longer felt forgotten, and neither would Walter Briggs. Spring arrived slowly in the Colorado mountains. The snow that had buried Silver Creek for months began retreating into the high country. Streams swelled with melting ice. Wildflowers pushed through damp earth. The valley transformed from white to green. Life returned, and with it came change. A year passed faster than Mason Reed could have imagined. The abandoned garage on Black Pine Road no longer looked abandoned. The weathered building had been restored carefully, not modernized, not transformed into something unrecognizable, preserved, its history honored, its purpose renewed. The faded sign had been replaced with a new one. Briggs Heritage Motor Center, the words stood proudly above the entrance, a name that belonged to both the past and the future. Every week, visitors arrived from across the country. Car enthusiasts, veterans, families, Students, historians, people curious about the remarkable collection hidden beneath the mountains. What began as a forgotten garage had become a destination. More importantly, it had become exactly what Walter Briggs envisioned. The foundation officially launched 6 months after the court ruling. Scholarships funded trade education. Veterans received career training. Apprentices learned restoration skills. Small grants helped struggling families and local businesses. The collection generated opportunity, purpose, hope. Everything Walter had hoped for. And somehow, Mason found himself at the center of it all. Not as an owner, not as a celebrity, as a caretaker, a steward. A man entrusted with protecting a vision larger than himself. Most mornings began the same way. Coffee on the front porch, mountain air, sunrise over the valley, shadow resting beside him. Peace. Real peace. Something Mason once believed impossible. The nightmares still came occasionally. PTSD didn't vanish simply because life improved, but the darkness no longer controlled him. Purpose had changed that. Community had changed that. People had changed that. For the first time since leaving the military, he belonged somewhere again. One morning he walked through the restoration workshop. The building buzzed with activity. Veterans rebuilt engines. Students learned fabrication skills. Retired mechanics shared knowledge accumulated over decades. The sound of tools echoed through the garage, not unlike the sound Walter Briggs once heard. The difference was that now the building was full of life. Mason paused beside a young veteran rebuilding a transmission. The man's hands were stained with grease, his concentration absolute. The scene reminded Mason of himself a year earlier, lost, searching, trying to find direction. Now dozens of people were finding exactly that. Because someone had chosen purpose over profit. Because Walter Briggs had refused to give up. Because Shadow refused to stop searching. The German Shepherd had become something of a local legend. Visitors asked about him constantly. Children wanted photographs. Veterans wanted stories. Tourists bought postcards featuring the famous K9. Shadow tolerated the attention with patient dignity. Most of the time, the dog still preferred long walks through the forest, still preferred quiet mornings, still preferred Mason. Some things never changed. Late one afternoon, Grace Holloway arrived carrying a folder. The attorney had become a regular part of the foundation. Friendship had slowly replaced professional obligation. She joined Mason outside beneath the shade of a large pine tree. "You realize we're ahead of schedule?" Mason laughed. "That's because you keep making impossible things happen." Grace smiled. "I learned from the best." She glanced toward Shadow. The dog lay nearby watching visitors enter the museum. "Actually," she added, "I learned from the second best." Mason followed her gaze. The smile that appeared came easily now, much more easily than before. Inside the folder were final plans for the dedication ceremony. The event would officially mark 1 year since the opening of the Briggs Heritage Motor Center. Town leaders planned to attend. State officials planned to attend. Veterans groups planned to attend. Even national automotive organizations planned to attend. The center had become far more successful than anyone imagined. The ceremony would include one final surprise: a monument. Mason had quietly approved the design months earlier. Very few people knew what it would reveal. The dedication day arrived beneath clear blue skies. Not a single cloud crossed the mountains. Silver Creek had never looked more beautiful. Hundreds of people gathered on the museum grounds. Families spread blankets across the grass. Children chased each other between exhibits. Classic automobiles gleamed beneath the sunlight. The atmosphere felt like a celebration. Because it was. A celebration of second chances. The mayor delivered a speech. Grace delivered a speech. Several veterans shared their stories. Many spoke about how the center had changed their lives. One man described finding employment after years of struggling. Another described rebuilding confidence through restoration work. A young student spoke about receiving a scholarship. The audience listened carefully, because these stories mattered. They were the real legacy. Not the cars, not the money, the people. Finally, the time came for the monument unveiling. A large cloth-covered structure stood near the museum entrance. Visitors whispered among themselves. Speculation spread through the crowd. Most assumed it honored Walter Briggs. Others believed it would honor Mason. Both guesses made sense. Walter created the vision. Mason protected it. As the crowd gathered, the mayor stepped toward the microphone. This monument represents the reason we're all standing here today. The audience applauded. The cloth remained in place. The mayor smiled. Many heroes played a role in this story. He paused. But one hero discovered what nobody else could. Mason felt emotion building in his chest, because he already knew what stood beneath the cloth. The mayor continued. One hero protected this legacy when it was threatened. The crowd grew quiet. Then the cloth was pulled away. Gasps immediately spread through the audience. Not because they were disappointed, because they were surprised. Standing beneath the afternoon sunlight was a bronze German shepherd, life-sized, proud, alert, faithfully recreated in remarkable detail. Shadow. The real Shadow sat beside Mason watching the reaction, completely unaware that hundreds of people were applauding a statue created in his honor. The plaque beneath the monument read, "To Shadow, who found what greed could not, protected what history almost lost, and gave forgotten people a second chance." Silence settled over the crowd. The good kind, the emotional kind. Many people wiped away tears. Veterans nodded quietly. Parents held children closer. The message reached everyone differently, but it reached everyone. Mason stepped forward. His hand rested gently on Shadow's head. The German shepherd leaned into the touch, exactly as he always had, exactly as he always would. For a long moment, Mason simply stood there, remembering the freezing truck, the nightmares, the loneliness, the auction, the garage, the hidden hatch, the vault, the attack, the injury, the fight. Every chapter, every struggle, every step. It all traced back to one stubborn dog refusing to walk away from a corner of concrete. The irony made him smile. A year earlier, Mason Reed had been a homeless veteran sleeping beside an abandoned lumberyard. Now he stood surrounded by friends, purpose, community, hope. The transformation felt extraordinary, yet the deeper truth was even more powerful. The treasure hadn't saved him. The collection hadn't saved him. The money hadn't saved him. Connection had. Purpose had. Loyalty had. The things that truly matter. As the ceremony ended, visitors gathered around the statue. Children posed for photographs. Veterans shook Mason's hand. Families explored the museum. Life continued moving forward. The sun slowly lowered toward the mountains. Golden light spread across Silver Creek. The same mountains that once watched a broken man arrive. The same mountains now watching him heal. Mason looked toward the horizon, then down at Shadow. The German shepherd gazed back with calm brown eyes. No words were necessary. They had survived everything together, and now they stood at the center of a legacy that would outlive them both. Because in the end, the true hero of the story was never the man who found the treasure. It was the dog who refused to stop searching. If you believe loyalty, courage, and doing the right thing still matter, type yes in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing this community come together from all across America and beyond. If stories about justice, perseverance, and ordinary people standing their ground mean something to you, subscribe and join us for the next story.